stop scrolling right now. In the last 48 hours, something in your perception shifted, and if you're watching this video at this exact moment, your brain has already detected a pattern that most people will never consciously recognize. This isn't about belief. This is about a neurological threshold that, once crossed, cannot be reversed. You've probably noticed it already. Old motivations feeling hollow, conversations seeming thinner, time behaving strangely. That's not confusion. That's your cognitive system upgrading itself, and what I'm about to show you will confirm what your awareness has already begun to recognize on its own. Before we go deeper, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. Not for me, but because this message needs to reach the people whose neural patterns are ready for it. Your engagement literally determines who sees this next. And here's what I need from you in the comments. Tell me your city or country, and answer this honestly. Have you felt something shift in the last few weeks that you couldn't quite explain? Drop it below, because what you're experiencing has a name, and understanding it changes everything. Now, let me show you exactly what's happening inside your consciousness right now. You know that feeling when you're scrolling through content and something makes you pause, not because it's loud or flashy, but because it speaks to something you've been thinking about but haven't quite put into words yet. That's where you are right now, and I want to be completely transparent with you from the start. This isn't going to be one of those videos that promises you overnight transformation or tells you that you're cosmically chosen for some grand destiny. What I'm going to share with you today is something far more practical and far more powerful. It's about a psychological threshold that changes how you experience literally everything, and the fascinating part is that most people cross it without even realizing what's happened. Before we dive deep into this, I genuinely appreciate you being here, and if you find value in what we explore together, subscribing to this channel helps me continue creating content that matters. A like tells the algorithm to share this with others who might need to hear it, and I promise, no manipulation, just honest value. Now, let's talk about what I call the recognition point. There's a concept in psychology that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's the idea that human consciousness operates in layers. Most of us spend our entire lives in what I call the reactive layer. This is where we experience something, immediately interpret it through our existing beliefs and past experiences, attach an emotion to it, and then respond based on that emotional charge. It happens so fast that we genuinely believe we're responding to reality itself, but we're actually responding to our interpretation of reality. And here's where it gets interesting. There's a moment in some people's lives where this process becomes visible to them, not through meditation or spiritual practice necessarily, although those can help, but through a kind of natural maturation of awareness. It's like suddenly being able to see the frame around a picture when you've only ever seen the picture itself. Once you see that frame, you can never fully unsee it. Your relationship with your own thoughts fundamentally changes. I discovered this not through any mystical experience, but through a period of intense frustration in my own life. I kept finding myself in the same patterns, same conflicts, same disappointments, and I remember sitting there one afternoon thinking, why do I keep doing this? And something clicked. Not emotionally, cognitively. I realized I wasn't actually responding to the situations themselves, but to a story I kept telling myself about what those situations meant. And the moment I saw that mechanism in action, the whole game changed. I'm sharing this with you because I think many of you watching this right now are at or near this same threshold. You've probably noticed that your old motivations don't hit the same way anymore. Things that used to excite you feel somewhat hollow. Drama that used to consume your attention now feels exhausting. And you might have interpreted this as depression or losing your passion, but what if it's actually the opposite? What if it's your consciousness becoming more efficient? Let me explain what I mean by efficiency. Your brain is an incredibly sophisticated prediction machine. It's constantly trying to anticipate what's going to happen next, based on pattern recognition from past experiences. This is useful for survival, but it creates a strange side effect. You end up living slightly in the past and slightly in the future, rarely fully in the present moment. Your attention is fragmented across memory, anticipation, and constant self-monitoring. This fragmentation requires enormous amounts of cognitive energy. It's like running multiple programs in the background on your computer. Everything slows down. Now imagine those background programs start shutting down, not because you forced them to, but because your system recognized they weren't necessary. Suddenly you have access to processing power you forgot you had. This is what I mean by efficiency. And this is what starts happening at the recognition point. So what actually changes at this threshold? The most significant shift is in how quickly you move from stimulus to response. In the reactive layer, something happens, you interpret it, you feel something about that interpretation, you identify with that feeling, and then you respond based on that identification. This chain can happen in seconds, but each link adds distortion. It's like a game of telephone with yourself. By the time you respond, you're often responding to something quite different from what actually occurred. At the recognition point, something remarkable happens. You start noticing the gap between what happens and what you think about what happens. That gap has always been there, but you've been moving through it so fast that it felt like one continuous experience. When you begin to perceive this gap, even briefly, you gain a kind of navigational freedom you didn't have before. Let me give you a concrete example. Someone criticizes your work. In the reactive layer, you hear the criticism, immediately interpret it as an attack on your competence, feel threatened, identify as someone being treated unfairly, and respond defensively. This happens almost instantaneously. But at the recognition point, you hear the criticism, and there's a brief pause, not forced, natural. In that pause, you notice your interpretation forming. You see the emotional charge building, and because you see it, you're no longer completely fused with it. You might still feel defensive, but you also see the defensiveness as a reaction rather than as truth. And from that perspective, you have options. You can respond to the actual content of the criticism rather than to your emotional interpretation of it. This might sound like a small thing, but it changes everything. Because this pattern doesn't just apply to criticism, it applies to desire, fear, ambition, relationships, every single area of your life. Here's what makes this so fascinating from a neuroscience perspective. Your brain is constantly trying to reduce prediction error. When something happens that doesn't match your expectations, your brain experiences this as a kind of error signal, and it motivates you to either change the situation or change your interpretation to make it match. This is why cognitive dissonance feels so uncomfortable. At the recognition point, something shifts in this mechanism. You become less disturbed by prediction errors because you're less identified with the predictions themselves. Your sense of self becomes less rigid, and when your self-concept is less rigid, the world feels less threatening. Things can be different from what you expected without creating an existential crisis. This flexibility is enormously valuable because life is fundamentally unpredictable. The more rigid your self-concept, the more suffering you experience when reality doesn't conform to it. I want to be very clear about something here. This is not about becoming emotionless or detached. That's a common misunderstanding. You still feel everything: joy, sadness, anger, love, all of it. But the feelings move through you more cleanly. They arise, they peak, they resolve. They don't get stuck in loops of rumination and identification. Think of it like weather passing through a landscape versus weather getting trapped in a valley. Same weather, different experience. And this is where many spiritual teachings get it wrong, in my opinion. They frame this shift as transcendence, as rising above the human experience. But that's not what happens. You don't transcend, you inhabit more fully, because you're no longer spending half your energy managing your self-image and defending your interpretations. That energy becomes available for actual engagement with life. So what does this look like in daily life? I'll share some patterns I've noticed both in my own experience and in conversations with others who've crossed this threshold. First, decision-making becomes significantly easier, not because you suddenly have clarity about what's right or wrong, but because you stop needing every decision to reflect your identity. When you're heavily identified with your self-concept, every choice becomes a referendum on who you are. Should I take this job? Well, what does that say about my ambitions, my values, my intelligence? The decision gets loaded with all this meaning. At the recognition point, decisions become more pragmatic. Will this job allow me to do work I find engaging while meeting my practical needs? Much simpler question, much easier to answer. Second, relationships become more honest. This one can be uncomfortable at first. When you're less concerned with maintaining a particular image of yourself, you stop performing in subtle ways. You stop saying what you think people want to hear. You stop pretending to be interested when you're not. And this doesn't make you rude or insensitive. It makes you real, and real connection, it turns out, is built on presence, not performance. Some relationships don't survive this shift, particularly relationships that were built on mutual performance or shared complaints. But the relationships that remain, or the new ones that form, tend to be much more satisfying because they're based on genuine compatibility rather than social choreography. Third, ambition changes its flavor. This is a subtle one. You don't stop having goals or wanting things, but the emotional charge around achievement shifts. Success stops being about validation and becomes more about expression. You create things because the process of creation is engaging, not because you need the result to prove something about yourself. And paradoxically, this often leads to better outcomes because you're not sabotaging yourself with performance anxiety or fear of failure. You're just doing the work. Fourth, suffering decreases, but not in the way you might expect. Pain still happens, loss still happens, difficulty still happens, but the secondary suffering that comes from resisting these experiences or making them mean something about your worth, that diminishes significantly. You can be sad without it meaning you're broken. You can fail without it meaning you're inadequate. The experience happens, and then it passes, leaving much less residue. Fifth, and this is perhaps the most noticeable shift, you develop a strange kind of immunity to manipulation, not because you become cynical or suspicious, but because you see the mechanisms that manipulation relies on. Marketing language that used to create desire in you just looks like obvious technique. Social pressure that used to influence your choices becomes visible as social pressure. Fear-based messaging that used to make you anxious reveals itself as fear-based messaging. You're not offended by these things. You just see them clearly, and seeing them clearly means they don't work on you the same way. This has enormous implications for how you navigate a world that's increasingly designed to capture and monetize your attention. Now, I want to address some common misconceptions about this shift because I think they prevent people from recognizing when it's happening to them. The first misconception is that it's dramatic. People expect some kind of peak experience, a moment of sudden enlightenment, fireworks in consciousness, And for some people, maybe it happens that way, but for most, it's subtle. You might not even notice it's happening until you look back and realize you've been responding to situations differently for weeks or months. The change is more like gradually adjusting to a new prescription in your glasses than like a lightning bolt of revelation. The second misconception is that it's permanent and irreversible. Yes, once you've seen certain patterns in your own cognition, you can't completely unsee them. But that doesn't mean you can't get caught up in reactive patterns again. You absolutely can. The difference is that now when you get caught up, part of you knows it. There's a kind of dual awareness. You're in the drama and observing the drama simultaneously. And that observing part gives you the option to step out of it, even if you don't always take that option. The third misconception is that it makes you special or superior. This is a trap that a lot of people fall into, and it actually prevents the shift from stabilizing. Because the moment you start identifying as someone who's had this recognition, who operates at this level, who sees what others don't, you've just created a new, more sophisticated ego structure. And ego structures, no matter how sophisticated, operate by the same mechanism of identification and defense that you were trying to move beyond. The recognition point isn't about becoming special, it's about becoming ordinary in a deeper way. It's about living without the constant need to be something other than what you are in this moment. The fourth misconception is that it solves all your problems. It doesn't. You still have to deal with practical challenges, relationship difficulties, health issues, financial concerns. What changes is your relationship to those challenges. You're not adding layers of psychological suffering on top of the practical difficulties. A problem remains a problem, but it's not also a referendum on your worth or a cosmic injustice. This makes problems much easier to address because you're not drowning in the emotional drama around them. And the fifth misconception is that it's the end of personal growth or development. Actually, it's often the beginning of real development, because you're no longer developing in service of defending a fragile self-image. You can learn new things without your identity being threatened when you're not good at them yet. You can receive feedback without interpreting it as an attack. You can acknowledge your limitations without it meaning you're inadequate. This creates a much more sustainable approach to growth. So how does someone actually reach this recognition point? I wish I could give you a formula, but I can't because it's not formulaic. However, I can share some patterns I've noticed in people who've crossed this threshold. First, there's usually a period of what I call productive frustration beforehand. You've tried the conventional approaches to whatever you're struggling with, and they're not working. You've read the books, applied the techniques, followed the advice, and you're still stuck. This frustration is productive because it starts to undermine your faith in your existing interpretive framework. You begin to suspect that maybe the way you're thinking about the problem is part of the problem. Second, there's often a moment of genuine not knowing, not the performance of humility, but actual cognitive surrender. You've stopped trying to figure it out, not because you've given up, but because you've exhausted your usual ways of understanding, and you're just sitting with the reality of not knowing what to do. In that space of not knowing, something different can emerge. Third, there's usually exposure to ideas or perspectives that challenge your fundamental assumptions about how consciousness works. This could come from books, conversations, personal experiences, anything that cracks open your certainty about the nature of self and reality. You don't have to believe these new perspectives. Just being exposed to them creates cognitive flexibility. Fourth, and this is crucial, there's often a shift from trying to change your experience to being willing to experience what's actually happening. This sounds simple, but it's profound. Most of us spend enormous energy trying to make our experience match what we think it should be. We should be happier, more motivated, less anxious, more certain. And all that shielding creates a kind of internal warfare. When you stop fighting what is and start being curious about it instead, something relaxes, and in that relaxation, recognition becomes possible. Fifth, there's often a reduction in cognitive load from external sources. This might mean less time on social media, less consumption of news and drama, less exposure to environments that keep you in reactive mode. It's not that you're hiding from the world, but you're creating space for your own thoughts to settle instead of constantly being stirred up by external input. I want to emphasize that none of this requires you to adopt any particular belief system or spiritual practice. Some people find meditation helpful, others find it in therapy, some through crisis, some through creative work, some through honest conversations. The path varies enormously. What seems to matter is the willingness to question your own certainties and the courage to sit with uncertainty without immediately reaching for comfortable answers. And here's something important. You can't force this. You can't will yourself into recognition. Trying to do so just creates a new layer of identification, the person trying to achieve recognition. It happens, when conditions are right. What you can do is create conditions that make it more likely. Reduce unnecessary cognitive noise. Practice noticing your thoughts rather than just thinking them. Be willing to be wrong about things you were certain about. Stay curious rather than defensive when your beliefs are challenged. These practices don't guarantee anything, but they create fertile ground. So what's it like to live from this place once the shift has stabilized? I can only speak from my own experience and from what others have shared with me, but there are some common themes. There's a quality of okayness that becomes baseline, not happiness necessarily, although happiness comes and goes, but a fundamental sense that regardless of what's happening, at the deepest level, you're okay. This isn't a belief you have to convince yourself of. It's a felt sense that's just there. Even when things are difficult, even when you're sad or scared or angry, there's a kind of ground beneath all of that that remains stable. There's also a shift in how you relate to time. The future stops feeling like it's where real life begins. The present moment stops being something to get through on your way to somewhere else. You're more fully here, even when here is uncomfortable. And paradoxically, when you stop living for the future, you tend to create a better future because you're making choices based on present clarity rather than future anxiety. Your relationship to your own mind changes significantly. Thoughts still arise, of course, emotions still emerge, but there's less identification with them. They're weather patterns moving through your awareness rather than definitions of who you are. This doesn't mean you ignore your thoughts or suppress your emotions. You engage with them, but from a different vantage point. You can think without being consumed by thought. You can feel without being overwhelmed by feeling. There's more comfort with paradox and contradiction. You can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without needing to collapse them into one correct view. You can appreciate why someone believes something you disagree with. You can change your mind without it being a crisis. You can be uncertain about important things without it generating anxiety. This cognitive flexibility is enormously valuable in a complex world. You become less reactive to other people's states. If someone is angry, you can recognize their anger without immediately taking it personally or trying to fix it. If someone is in pain, you can be present with their pain without absorbing it as your own. This doesn't make you cold or uncaring. It makes you more capable of genuine support because you're not managing your own emotional reactivity while trying to help them. There's a natural simplification that happens in your life, not because you're following some minimalist philosophy, but because unnecessary complexity becomes obvious and unappealing. You let go of commitments that don't serve you. You simplify relationships that have become overly complicated. You stop maintaining things out of guilt or obligation. What remains is what actually matters to you, and because you're clear about what matters, you can invest in it more fully. And there's a quality I can only describe as increased porosity. You're less defended, more open, more available to experience. This makes you more vulnerable in some ways, but it also makes life more vivid. Colors seem richer. Conversations seem more interesting. Simple pleasures become genuinely satisfying. It's not that the world has changed. Your aperture has opened. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. Everything I've described can sound abstract when you're hearing it explained. The real understanding comes from direct experience, not from intellectual comprehension. I can describe what water tastes like, but until you drink it, the description remains just concepts. The same is true here. If what I'm pointing to resonates with something you've already begun to notice in your own experience, then these words are just confirming and clarifying what you already know. If it doesn't resonate yet, that's completely okay. This isn't about being ready or not ready. It's about where you are in your own development. And wherever that is exactly where you need to be. What I hope this video does is give you language for experiences you might be having but haven't been able to articulate, because when you can name something, you can work with it more consciously. You can notice when you're operating from reactive patterns versus when you're operating from recognition. You can choose moment by moment which mode serves you better in any given situation, and over time, that choosing itself becomes less necessary because recognition becomes your default mode. I also want to acknowledge that talking about this stuff can sound self-important or grandiose. That's not my intention. I'm not claiming to have figured everything out or reached some ultimate state. I'm just sharing observations about a shift that happened in my own consciousness and that I've seen happening in others. If it's useful to you, great. If not, that's fine too. The last thing I want is for this to become another thing you feel you should be experiencing but aren't, another way to feel inadequate. That would completely miss the point. The recognition point isn't about achieving something. It's about relaxing into what's already here when you stop trying so hard to be something other than what you are. So where does that leave us? If you've watched this far, first, thank you. I genuinely appreciate your time and attention. In a world full of noise and distraction, choosing to engage with something substantial means a lot. Whether this resonated with you or not, whether you're experiencing this shift or just curious about it, I respect your journey and wherever you are on it. If this video was valuable to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because it helps content like this reach people who might benefit from it. And if you feel moved to leave a like, that tells YouTube's algorithm to share this with others who are searching for these kinds of conversations. But here's what I'm most curious about. I'd love to know where you're watching this from and what your experience has been with what we've discussed today. Drop a comment below telling me your city or country, and if you're comfortable sharing, tell me whether anything in this video connected with something you've been experiencing in your own life. I read every comment, and I learn a lot from hearing your perspectives. Your experience matters, and your voice adds to the conversation in ways that help everyone, including me. If you found this valuable and want to explore these ideas further, I've got more videos on the channel that go deeper into specific aspects of consciousness, decision-making, relationships, and how to navigate life with more clarity and less suffering. This isn't a conclusion, it's an ongoing conversation, and I'm grateful you're part of it. Remember, there's nothing you need to do with what you've heard here. No practice to start, no belief to adopt, no level to achieve. Just maybe pay attention to the gap between what happens and what you think about what happens. That gap is where everything changes, and if you notice it even once, you've already begun. That's all there is to it. Take care of yourself, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep questioning, keep noticing, and most importantly, keep being honest with yourself about your actual experience rather than what you think your experience should be. That honesty is where real transformation begins.